Hello and welcome to Chapter 8, Pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is the study of physiology of altered functioning in the presence of disease. To put that another way, or a little bit more simply, it's really the study of how the body responds in an inappropriate manner or the only manner it can when it has the presence of disease or some kind of illness or injury. So there are some adaptations in cells and tissues when they're exposed to adverse conditions. There is atrophy, which is the shrinking or wasting of a cell. Hypertrophy, which is the volumizing of a cell. Hyperplasia, which is the reproduction of a cell exactly the same as the initial one. Dysplasia, which is the creation of a cell that is non-healthy from a particular cell. That would be something like a cancerous cell. And then metaplasia, which is a normal cell converting into a new but different normal cell. Disturbances in fluid balance. So the disruption of homeostasis can cause or exacerbate various disease processes. So there can be some changes in fluids. That could be the volume or the electrolyte balances. The core four being sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. There are also phosphates in the body. The degree of fluid imbalance required depends on the size of your patient, the age, and their underlying medical condition. So obviously a child or a toddler is going to be small in size, and a small fluid overload or a small amount relative to an adult amount of dehydration is going to affect them quite a bit differently than an adult. Underlying medical conditions, right, where somebody's already sick or compromised, that shift in fluid balance can ultimately impact them to a higher degree than a normal, full-size, healthy adult. Edema, this is excessive swelling by fluid being trapped in the body tissue. We kind of talk about this as third spacing. And this is ultimately when the arterial and venous system are not in their healthiest way, or the cardiovascular system is compromised. This also starts to affect the lymphatic system. We end up with these third space fluids where we have fluid that's trapped between cells, it's outside of the venous system, and we're unable to evacuate it to the appropriate place so that it can be excreted. The result is, as you can see in the picture there, where people have the soft tissue becomes swollen or enlarged and will indent really easily and not rebound to its former shape readily. So these are some of those fluid imbalances, and this is isotonic fluid deficit. This is a decrease in the extracellular fluid with the proportionate losses of sodium and water. And so these are maybe the people that you're looking at that are dehydrated. And then we have isotonic fluid excess, which is an increase of sodium and water in the extracellular fluid. So this is really kind of a different way of putting in dehydrated or edemic. I'm going to talk a little bit about the electrolytes. Sodium regulates fluid balance. If you guys remember the waterfall salt or vice versa in the renal system. So if we have an excess of sodium in the body, we're going to retain water, which is going to increase the total fluid volume and increase blood pressure. And I want everybody to remember that hyper means more or excess, and hypo means less or not enough. So hypernatremia is a serum sodium level of 143 milliequivalents per liter or higher. Hyponatremia is 135 milliequivalents per liter or less. Potassium is the next of the core four. This is also crucial to many cellular functions. The normal level is 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. Hypokalemia is decreased and hyper is elevated. Calcium, the normal serum level is 8.2 to 10.2 milligrams per deciliter. And then obviously hypo is decreased and hyper is increased above normal. This is a pretty good pictogram or table of calcium with low blood calcium and high blood calcium, and where it is ingested and absorbed or created and excreted or stored. So make sure you guys get a good look at this and try to remember the particular areas where these things happen inside the body. Phosphates are essential to a lot of body functions. Again, hypo is decreased from normal, and then hyper is increased from normal. Magnesium, the last of the core four, 50% is stored in the bones, the other 49% is in soft body tissue cells, and 1% is in the extracellular fluid. The normal range is 1.3 to 2.1 milliequivalents per liter. Hypo is decreased, and hyper is increased above normal. pH, for those of you that haven't had the joy of a chemistry class yet, is a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of a solution. Remember that this is basically a scale of 0 to 14, with 7.0 being neutral. The lower the pH, the higher the acidity, and the higher the pH, the more alkaline it is. Disturbances of acid-base balance are associated with disturbances of the potassium balance in the body. It's a good pictogram of the acid-base balancing. If you look, near balance is right around 7.4, and normal pH is 7.35 to 7.45. So you guys want to kind of just see how that works, right? A normal byproduct of metabolism is to take sugars, and that creates carbonic acid, which will be exhaled as carbon dioxide from the body. So that will dive into a little bit of the respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, and metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. Metabolic acidosis is associated with any acidosis related, or I should say unrelated to the respiratory system. Respiratory alkalosis is associated with hyperventilation, and then respiratory acidosis is hypoventilation, with metabolic alkalosis occurring due to an excessive loss of acid. So try to remember that if we're not breathing enough, we're retaining too much CO2, which then is the acidosis in the respiratory system. If we breathe too much, it becomes alkalotic, and if you're vomiting, you're losing acid, and if you have diarrhea, you're losing base, which is the cellular injuries. There's a few main players in the process that cause cellular injury: hypoxia, ischemia, chemical injury, infectious injury, immunologic injury, physical damage, and inflammatory injury. We'll go through some of these processes here in the next couple of slides. All right, so cellular injury continued. These are just a couple of slides of the manifestations that occur at a microscopic level. So as you look into the picture, you can see that in the picture to the right, there are a lot of parts of the inner workings of a cell that have now been lysed and are freestanding and able to touch other cells that may be intact. This is actually a dangerous situation because the insides of cells are toxic to other cells or other parts of the body. Hypoxic injuries, it's a common cause of cellular injury. Cells that are not receiving oxygen for more than a few seconds will produce a chemical mediator, which is a distress signal, which will create an inflammatory response and can create more cell damage. Chemical injury. So this isn't a end-all, be-all, long-standing list, but these are pretty big, broad strokes. Cyanide inhibits the ability of the cell to pick up or release oxygen. Pesticides have various chemicals that can interfere with different parts of the cellular process or destroy parts of the phospholipid layer. Leads or other heavy metals have different components that can actually injure the nervous system or other parts of the body. Carbon monoxide, due to the fact that carbon monoxide is poisonous to the body because it does not have a second oxygen molecule, which makes it unable to support life. It also happens to have a much higher affinity to the red blood cell than oxygen does. So it's really, really hard to not only detect it, but also to override it and get it to push off of the red blood cell. High doses of ethanol can cause serious injury as well, because infectious injuries. So for the most part, the invasion of bacteria, fungi, or virus can actually cause lots of havoc in the body. Viruses are able to actually invade the cell. They're so small that they can actually get through the phospholipid layer and then take over the metabolic process of the host cell, and then it uses it to replicate. I want you guys to think about like HIV and the herpes simplex. HIV invading most any cell that it wants to because it's how small it is, and then with the herpes simplex, it specifically invades nerve cells and takes over that host cell and is protected by only replicating at certain points of time, which is where you guys would see like a cold sore or outbreak. Otherwise, it lies dormant inside the nerve cell, making it really hard to attack from a medical standpoint. People with depressed immune systems are less capable of fighting off microorganisms. And so for you guys to think about that, it's really just about the common flu. If you're a younger to normal adult-aged human, if you get the flu, for the most part, within 2 to 7 days, your body's fought that off and destroyed the virus. If you're already immunocompromised, thinking somewhere along the lines of somebody, say, that had a transplant and is on an immunosuppressant, the flu can be a death sentence. We're unable to actually stop that virus from replicating, and ultimately the virus replicates to such a degree that the body is unable to deal with it and ends up in death. Bacteria have their own way of kind of dealing with how not to be destroyed, and they can develop a hard capsule that protects them from phagocytes, and that particular phagocyte would go and try to basically engulf the bacteria and ultimately destroy it inside of itself. Some of these things are fairly sneaky, and they're able to keep themselves alive inside the body. So we have immunologic and inflammatory injury. Inflammation is the protective response in the presence of a cellular injury. Remember the previous slide where we were talking about hypoxia, and then the cell creating a mediator, which is an inflammatory signal, and the body will respond in kind by creating other parts of inflammation, right, which is heat, redness, tenderness, swelling, and pain. We'll get a little bit into that, and there's a slide in here that shows how that system works. If the inflammatory process is severe, systemic effects become evident. So the easiest way to think about that is to consider if you have an allergic reaction to something, it's really localized. The body sends out mediator signals, and the immune system works locally in that particular response to the offending agent. In somebody who is severely allergic to that and goes into anaphylaxis, that inflammatory process is way overloaded and it becomes more of a systemic thing. We have widespread urticaria, vasodilation, we start leaking fluids into third space, which lowers blood pressure, and then we get bronchoconstriction and bronchospasm, creating the hypoxia throughout the body. Here's a good pictogram of how these work and the mediators of inflammation. You have the capillary dilation, right, which increases the blood flow. But we also have that increased capillary permeability, like I said, where we actually have fluid leaking out of the vascular space into the soft tissue, right, which is where we're going to get that urticaria or hives, the attraction of leukocytes, and that's a bunch of white cells to the site of the injury, and then we'll end up ultimately with a systemic response where you can get the fever, leukocytosis, and that's that heat to the offending area or throughout the entire body. So we're going to look at injurious genetic factors, abnormal genes, mutation of the gene during meiosis, which can be hereditary or as a result of other causes later in life. Something that you guys should consider is that as cells reproduce and split and then copy themselves, along the way, sometimes we can lose parts of that DNA sequence, which may cause the cell to kind of mutate, the genes ultimately mutating because they're losing parts of the material that they need to, and this ultimately will end up damaging cells. So this can become a chromosomal disorder, which would create like premature development of atherosclerosis or obesity and some other things. Nutritional imbalances, which can cause obesity or malnutrition, right? Both of these can actually have detrimental effects to other cells. We can have a vitamin excess or deficiency or mineral excess or deficiency. And when we're talking about vitamin excess, we're talking about the fat-soluble vitamins, which is primarily A, D, E, and K. Minerals, which we can end up storing too many of and cause toxicity as well. Some physical agents for cellular damage or death is heat, cold, radiation. The degree of a cellular injury is determined by the strength of the agent and length of the exposure. So let's think about this in some simplistic terms. In regards to heat, you could have like a simple flame contact, which might cause some pain and redness to the superficial skin, all the way to charring and complete annihilation of missing tissue that could include up to the bone. The same for cold, right? We can have a brief cold exposure, which might cause some very superficial cellular death, which would cause some chapping or something like that along those lines on the skin, all the way to frostbite, where we actually have cells that have completely frozen, which the fluid inside of it then bursting that cellular wall and causing cellular death. Radiation, we can look at that same thing, the strength and the agent, right? If you guys remember any of the training that you should have gotten on some kind of radiological event, alpha radiation, alpha wave radiation being weakest, can literally be stopped by a piece of paper, with beta being stopped with just maybe some heavy clothing or some simplistic shielding, and then gamma being the strongest of the three, it being able to go through many, many inches thick concrete and still do cellular damage. And try to remember that, as that radiation goes through, the biggest effect of radiation is that as that particle wave goes through, it's knocking pieces of the gene out of the DNA, and that causes mutation, or it makes the cell incompatible with life, and it ultimately dies. Apoptosis is normal cell death. It's part of the normal development problem. Apoptosis is normal cell death. It's part of the normal development, organogenesis, immune function, and tissue growth. So as things age, there's a certain time frame on that cell. It's going to divide, and ultimately the original cell is going to die. The proteins and the DNA undergo controlled degradation that allows other parts of that DNA remnant to be taken up and be reused by neighboring cells. It's going to take some of those materials so long as it was in its normal fashion, and it will use those components to help themselves replicate or continue life. The inhibition of normal course of apoptosis allows destructive cellular proliferation. So here's a couple of the ways that apoptosis can be, or cellular death can be created, and one of two things is going to happen, right? We can have a virus or some kind of radiation or a chemical or carcinogenic pathway, or you could have that physical injury, right? Say some kind of crush or freezing or burning or something like that. When that attacks that cell, it creates an abnormal cell because some of the DNA is now mutated. And if we have a really effective immune system, the body will turn against an abnormal cell. It knows that it's not correct, and it will actually destroy that cell. And all is well in the world. If we have an ineffective immune system, that cell with the differed DNA can actually replicate itself, and it becomes what we call cancer. Necrosis is tissue death. It is a morphologic change that occurs following cellular death. Simple necrosis is just the actual term for noted cellular death in plant or animal material. Derived necrosis is a little bit more complex. There's a couple of different forms of that. There's caseation, which is a tissue that when it dies kind of looks more like cheese. This is usually something out of that's been derived from like an infection from tuberculosis. You can have dry gangrene, which is a different type of necrosis. This is when we lose the ability to perfuse tissue. This often happens in the fingers and toes, or distal areas that rely heavily on capillary action. As those lose their ability to receive nutrition and oxygen and offload waste products, those cells die and they become necrotic. But it's not like anything that's wet. The tissue is not lysing and kind of leaving the body in a liquid form. So we call that a dry gangrene. Turn black and start to come back. It looks almost like mummification. Then we have fat liquefaction, which is where the fat cells are basically damaged from some kind of physical means, and it releases fatty acids, which ultimately will combine with calcium, and it creates kind of like a soap, which is toxic to the body. Hypoperfusion, that occurs when the level of tissue perfusion decreases below normal, and that is really kind of in a nutshell what we're calling shock, right? Shock defined is an abnormal state associated with inadequate oxygen and nutrient delivery to the cell. So I want everybody to think about that. If we're unable to create a normal pathway to get oxygen or nutrition to the cell, and then ultimately be able to offload the carbon dioxide and waste products from cellular metabolism, that is what we're going to call shock. And as that tissue becomes more and more hypoperfused, the more likely it is to die, and we're going to see the effects of that in organ failure. Types of shock. We're going to have a couple of different types, and there's a few slides on this. So any shock is going to be inadequacy of central or peripheral circulation. So central shock is going to be cardiogenic shock or obstructive shock. So here's a pretty good picture of cardiac tamponade versus a good healthy heart. You can see the color change there. Looking at the pictures here, You can see the swelling around the aortic wall, and you can see the small rupture, the ascending aorta. Peripheral shock is going to be hypovolemic shock, that's the circulating blood volume, insufficient to deliver adequate oxygen or nutrition or nutrients to the cell. That is somebody who, in a lay way to put it, has a hole in them and they've lost a significant amount of blood. The other way to look at that is distributive shock, which is somebody who perhaps is septic and they have widespread dilation of the vessels, and that is very much like the anaphylaxis, where we have a capillary permeability. We start to kind of leak that fluid into interstitial space, and it's not where it needs to be, which is in the vascular system, so that we can maintain pressure to have that gas exchange and then nutrition and waste product exchange. Anaphylactic shock is histamines and other vasodilators released, and this is widespread. It's all over the body, and we're looking at somebody that, again, is third spacing a lot of fluids and has other issues coming on with the bronchoconstriction or bronchospasm. Septic shock, that's basically created from a widespread infection. And then neurogenic shock is from the spinal cord injury. So in neurogenic shock, we're talking about the inability of the body to tell the vascular system below the level of injury to vasoconstrict, because it's no longer receiving that signal from the nervous system. It will vasodilate, and it, again, from that lower level, it will allow capillary leakage into the body, and so we have a massive dump of blood pressure and become hypotensive. Here's a good picture on how that works. As you can see, everything from this gentleman's neck down to the feet is basically dilated, and that particular person now is unable to perfuse the brain or their organs because of the massive increase in tank size. So most types of shock are characterized by reduced cardiac output, circulatory insufficiency, and a rapid heartbeat. To diagnose shock, we want to evaluate the presence and the volume of peripheral pulses, and then we're assessing the end organ perfusion function, right? So we need to maintain a blood pressure of somewhere between 60 and 70 systolic so that we can actually perfuse the liver and kidneys. If we do not maintain that blood pressure as a very minimum, we end up going into organ failure, and that can be acute or chronic, but even an acute organ failure can be a life threat if we do not remedy the situation. Multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, MODS. That's a progressive condition that occurs in some critically ill patient. A concurrent failure of two or more organs or organ systems initially unharmed, right? So we have primary and secondary MODS. And this is just getting a little bit deeper into what I was speaking about earlier. If we are unable to perfuse those organs, then they take some kind of failure, and then that creates a cascade or a chaining event. The body's self-defense mechanism, the immune system, includes all structures and processes associated with the body's defense against foreign substances. So let's think about that in regards to anaphylaxis, right? It's an immune system response, and it's maybe a little overactive to a protein that it deems as a foreign substance that's harmful to it. Anatomic barriers decrease the chances of foreign substances invading the body, and that's pretty typically, that's the skin being intact, not allowing something inside the body, or the GI tract, or some other normal means of keeping something from getting inside the body. So the body's defense reaction to any foreign substance is a natural immunity or an acquired immunity. Natural immunity means that you were born with it, you didn't actually have to be exposed to it, and the acquired immunity is an easy one. Again, like from the previous chapter, is the flu or perhaps the chickenpox virus. If you've acquired the chickenpox virus, then you should be immune to it. Your body will develop an immunity to it. The same thing is if you're vaccinated against things such as Hep A or Hep B. Once you've been given a weakened form of that, you should develop an immunity to that full-strength virus. Immunogen is an antigen capable of generating an immune response, right? So that's anything that turns your body on to recognize it in the future and be able to defeat it before it becomes life-threatening. So let you guys take a good, long, hard look at this pictogram. You guys should be able to kind of see how this works, and it's actually a pretty good process. This is more on the immune response, humoral immunity, which is the B cell lymphocytes produce antibodies called immunoglobulins, and then cell-mediated immunity. The subgroups of T lymphocytes destroy foreign material. This is well covered in your book. Make sure that you read this. This is things that you should see in your quizzes. Another great pictogram of how this works. A little bit more on the inflammatory response, the response of tissue to the body to irritation or injury, right? And so this could be anything from simple sunburn to, like perhaps you roll your ankle and then you develop that swelling because of the tearing of the ligaments in the ankle. So the inflammation reaction and the immune response are independent processes. They don't need to actually happen together. Acute inflammation responses involve vascular and cellular components, and that means that the cells that were injured signal the mediators, and the vascular system allows fluid and other things into the tissue around that signal. Polymorphonuclear neutrophils arrive at the site of the injury. This is intravascular phase and extravascular phase. The cellular event sequence, margination, activation, adhesion, transmigration, or chemotaxis. These are all covered in your book heavily. Make sure that you know most of this. And we have the cellular products of inflammation, which is cytokines, interleukins, interferon, and lymphokines. Normal wound healing involves the repair of damaged tissue, the removal of inflammatory debris, and the restoration of tissues to a normal state, and then finished with a regeneration of cells. Factors that can lead to a dysfunctional wound healing may be local or systemic. Another great pictogram. You should guys take a good look at this and see how this works as far as a traumatic injury, and then how the body goes about repairing itself immediately to long-term, where we end up with a healed yet scarred injury. Variances in immunity and inflammation. Variances in immunity and inflammation. Hypersensitivity is the response of the body to any substance to which the patient has an increased sensitivity. So the type 1 is immediate hypersensitivity reaction. Type 2 is cytotoxic hypersensitivity. Type 3 is tissue injury caused by immune complexes. And type 4 is cell-mediated hypersensitivity. Make sure you guys take a good look at this pictogram. Make sure that you see the way that this system is working. The immune system targets different molecules depending on its hypersensitivity reaction, autoimmune reactions, and immunodeficiencies. So if we have an immunodeficiency, we are unable to actually attack that offending agent. And if we have an autoimmune reaction, that means that the immune system is attacking something that would normally be a normal body system. Some of the factors that cause disease processes are genetic, environmental, age-related, and sex-associated. So some people have a genetic disposition to cardiovascular disease. Environmental factors would be something like cigarette smoking causing lung cancer or COPD. Age-related factors is as we age and we become more immunocompromised. That's going to affect the way that we're able to fight off diseases or any of the other injuries or illnesses. And then sex-associated factors. There's obviously some things that are, men and women do not have the same organs, and men and women are prone to sometimes sex-specific disease processes. Things that are uncontrollable are your genetics and race. Think about, again, you have a genetic disposition to maybe a high propensity to cancer or cardiovascular disease, and then race. One of the ones that would stand out most would be like sickle cell anemia, which almost exclusively affects people of African race. The controllable factors are, if you know that you have a high propensity to cancer, you should probably not drink. The controllable factors would be things like environmental. You smoking, drinking alcohol, not really eating well, or lack of physical activity, and then stress having a very significant role in how the body deals with sickness or injury. An analysis of disease risk involves the consideration of disease rates and disease risk factors. All studies of a disease should consider the incidence, the prevalence, and the mortality of the disease. Right? And like a good one to look at on this would again be the flu. So how often or what is the rate at which people end up having the flu? And then how many people are killed as a result of that particular flu virus. And we want to make sure that we're looking at the risk factors, which would be age, right? The young and the elderly would be at a higher risk factor, and then sex differences often interact with that as well. Familial diseases and associated risk factors. True genetic risk is passed through generations by an inherited gene. This again would be people who have a genetic level, have a higher propensity for cardiovascular disease, diseases with familial tendency cluster in family groups, and then immunologic diseases are caused by hyperactivity or hypoactivity of the immune system. This is a great pictogram of the immune system being hyperactive with somebody who would ultimately end up being anaphylactic to a particular protein or foreign substance. Look a little bit into the cancers and pathophysiology with malignant growths, and then diabetes, which is one of the most significant endocrine diseases. Right? Diabetes is or can be caused by an autoimmune disorder. Hemolytic disorders, hemolytic anemia, hemophilia, and hemochromatosis. take a look at the way that this all works. You guys should read all three of these in your book, and you can see the pictogram and the stages in which all of this interacts. Cardiomyopathy, mitral valve prolapse, coronary heart disease, hypertension, and stroke. These are all familial diseases, and we can end up actually kind of predicting who might suffer from most of these disease processes based on genetics. So if you're looking at the two pictures here, you can kind of see what we talk about when we're talking about ventricular hypertrophy. And if you remember what I was saying about hypertrophy, that's the enlargement of particular cells, right? On the left, you have a normal interventricular septum. And then if you look at the right, you can see that big left portion there, or I should say red portion there, should be representing the left ventricle. If you look at the tissue on the right, it's much more enlarged and thicker, which decreases the volume of the left ventricle. That's left ventricular hypertrophy. It means the heart's enlarged on the left ventricle, and its ability to pump is decreased. Renal disorders, gout and kidney stones, and this is when the body is unable to excrete certain things. Gout predominantly is an acid that accumulates in the feet and creates intense pain. And then kidney stones is several minerals that can accumulate and turn into small rock formations that are very painful if you are able to excrete them through the urinary tract, and may need to be surgically or medically reduced so that you can have them removed. Gastrointestinal disorders, you can have malabsorption disorders, lactose intolerance, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, peptic ulcer disease, gallstones, or obesity. All of these things can be passed generation to generation because it's sometimes a genetic issue. Neuromuscular disorders, Huntington's disease, muscular dystrophy. Some more familial diseases, and this would be the neuromuscular disorders: Huntington's disease, muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis, and Alzheimer's disease. Psychiatric disorders being schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. These are thought to be something that is hereditary. Stress can cause a physiologic response. Physiologic stress allow the body to make a change that makes it necessary for the cells or the body to adapt. The general adaptation syndrome is alarm, resistance, and then exhaustion. Think about this in an adrenal issue. This is another chart or pictogram showing the adrenal issues and what we're expecting to happen until it becomes exhausting. Continuing on with the adrenal issues. And then we get into the effects of chronic stress. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis controls the reactions to stress. While we constantly tax that system, it leads to a loss of the normal control mechanism. And then ultimately what we need to discuss is that coping mechanisms play a role in the physiologic response to stress, right? So if you have a healthy coping mechanism and you're able to decompress or remove those stressors from your life, you allow your body to recover, and it's less likely to end up in that adrenal complex.